where we left off was the end of chapter 7. So I'm briefly going to touch on the middle of chapter 7 to the end really, really fast, just to remember where we left off last time, because it really feeds into what we're about today. The Jews had now gotten to the point, the Ark of the Covenant was safely in Kiryat Yearim, in a place where it blessed the people for 20 years. And now there was the concern about the Philistines, the Plishtim, and the Jews asked Shmuel HaNavi, the prophet Samuel, to please pray to God for peace from the Philistines. And that's where we kind of left off. Let's just refresh our memories. Vayihi Shmuel ma'aleh olah plishtim nikshula milchama b'Yisrael, and the Philistines came to make war on the Jews. Vayar'eim Hashem b'kol gadol b'yomahu al plishtim va'yehumeim, and by God's miracle, and I spent a lot of time on it last week, but as I said, now we're just quickly remembering where we left off last week, so I'm not going into great detail, but God made those miraculous noises from heaven, like the ones that accompanied the hailstones during the plagues of Egypt, and the ones that were at Mount Sinai when the giving of the Torah. And it confounded the Philistines. They couldn't focus, they couldn't concentrate, they couldn't think. The noise was so incredibly unbearable. Vayinagfu l'fnei Yisrael, and they got wiped out by the Jewish army. Vayetzu anshe Yisrael min hamitzpah v'yirdefu et plishtim, and they had them on the run. The Jews had the Philistines on the run, and they pursued them. Vayakum ad mitachat leveit kar, and they really wiped them out. And in the aftermath, vayikanu plishtim v'lo yasvu od lavo b'gvul Yisrael, the Philistines basically were crushed, and as a result, they did not make any more war against the Jews, against Israel. But Hashem b'plishtim kol yemei Shmuel, for the duration of Samuel's life, there never was any more trouble with the Philistines. And I even gave the example how Jordan had been part of the 1948 war and the 1956 war against Israel, joining with Syria and Egypt and so many other Arab countries. But in 1967, when they once again joined war against Israel and had all their territory, Judea, Samaria, the eastern part of the city of Jerusalem, et cetera, taken, they've never been in another war for like 55 years. Whatever else we've had to deal with Jordan, they've never again gotten into another. They used to get into a war every 5-10 years. And then they finally felt what happens when they've lost one war too many. And so this is what happened to the Philistines. They were crushed, and they did not bother Israel again during the time of Shmuel. So everybody went back to where they were. The cities that the Philistines had occupied and seized from Israel during the years of Philistine wars in which the Philistines had won, all had to be returned. Just as in 1967, Judea and Samaria were returned, and in the same way, you had Ekron and Gat and all those Philistine cities, so to speak, in Gaza, returned back to the Jews. Vayishpot Shmuel et Yisrael kol yemei chayav. And for the rest of his life, Shmuel was the unquestioned leader of the Jews. He was their judge, he was their prophet, he was like their king, but he wasn't a king. And he didn't have the authority or rule as a king, and he didn't need it because he was so universally respected and deferred to. And he made it, and again, we learned it last week in much greater detail. I'm just quickly reviewing. He made his circuits every year, going from city to city, to Bethel, to Gilgal, to Mitzpah. And therefore, since people couldn't all come to him, he made it his business to go around the country to provide his personal input and presence and leadership from place to place. V'shafaret Yisrael kol hamakamot ha'eleh, and he, throughout the country, in all these different places, was the judge, and he was based in Ramah. That's where he lived, at the Shuvato, Ramataki Shambeto. and he lived in Ramah. That's where it was home. Visham Shafarat Yisrael by Ben Shamas Berchle Hashem. And let's just very, very quickly remember the map a little bit, some of these places we've mentioned, that you have the Gaza Strip, what we call today, in those days is called Philistia, and you had cities like Ekron, Ashdod, Gat. These were Israeli cities that the Philistines had conquered, and now they had to return Gat and Ekron to the Jews. And we said that the ark had come back to Kiryat Ye'arim. That's what the arrows are taking us on the journey. The ark finally worked its way to Kiryat Ye'arim. It stopped off at Bet Shemesh where the people were irreverent, leading to a plague. But in Kiryat Ye'arim, they were somber, and they enjoyed 20 years blessing there. Mitzpah was the central religious gathering area, sort of like a Washington, D.C., or Jerusalem, but not a Jerusalem, but a place where people gathered in large numbers. There's reference to Bethel, and prior to that, Shiloh had been the center at the time of Eli the Kohen. One more map. Smaller cities, but again, there's Gaza, Ashdod, Ashkelon. There's Ekron and Gat. You could see it's inside the yellow boundary of Philistia, inside the yellow boundary of the Philistine country. But some of these cities also were in the Jewish part, and the Philistines expanded their boundary, and then they had to give some of these cities back to the Jews. We said again that the ark went to Kiryat Ye'arim. Shmuel lived right near there in Ramah. The people gathered in Mitzpah. By way of comparison, there's Jerusalem. So you get a bit of a feeling of, again, Israel is not the size of the United States of America or the Soviet Union. It's a smaller sized country. And this is where everything is. There's the center of the action in Judea, in the lands of Judea and Benjamin. There's Bethlehem. Okay, so let's go back to the text. Thank you again for being with us, everybody. And we continue. Shmuel, we said at the end of class, lived to be 52 years old. So he actually lived a young life. Life longevity, the amount of years an average person lived in those days, we're now at a point that they were living the kind of life longevity that you associate with life today. And so it would not at all be extraordinary for someone to live 70 years, give or take. Okay, maybe because of modern medicine and science and whatever, maybe people live about 10 years longer now. But it would be common to live in their 70s. It's not unusual. So he died actually considered to be very young at 52. And I taught you last week a passage in the Talmud where he had expressed to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, to God, his dismay that one of the most important things he did in his lifetime, anointing the first king of Israel, King Shaul, was going to be brought to a quick end. And here he had, as the prophet of the generation, had hoped that his action would create a dynasty that would outlive him. And instead, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, for God's reasons, as we are going to learn more, took away the kingship from Saul, and said that after he would die, David would establish, he didn't name David, but someone more worthy than you would establish a new dynastic line. And this was given for Shmuel to know. And I taught you the Talmudic passage in that exchange back and forth. He said, look, what Moses did lasted long term, what I'm doing. Anyway, it was all part of that discussion that explained how it came to pass that Shmuel lived 52 years. And in his last years, he suddenly became very, very elderly looking. so that people should not think he was dying, that God was killing him young in punishment for some sin, by God miraculously making him look and appear very, very old. People understood his death, whatever the age might have been, as being a natural experience because of his evident age. He seemed, for whatever the reason, he seemed very elderly. Okay. So he ruled, he was the shofet, he was like the judge and the leader through the end of his life, pretty much, just a little bit short of the end of his life. Let's see what happens in chapter 8. Very fateful chapter, very fateful. And we're going to be going a bit afield during class as we see where it takes us. Vayehi kasher zaken Shmuel. As Shmuel suddenly turned very elderly, in other words, also unknown to everyone at that moment, but for us, close to death, closing in on it. Vayasem et banav shoftim liYisrael. He appointed his two sons, Yoel and Aviyah, to be his successors. However, they did not follow in his ways. And it's a long discussion about it, what went wrong, etc., etc. The Talmud says that essentially they were more focused on the administration of their job, on seeing to it that everybody at the center of where they worked, at the place where the sacrifices were being offered, that all the administrative staff were being paid properly. And so Yoel and Aviyah spent a lot of time on, let's say, fundraising, to the degree that we could use a contemporary term to convey what they were doing. And therefore, they did not make the circuits. For example, their concern about money, not personal enrichment, but their concern about financially running the operation, led them to not travel around the country. And in other ways, they simply did not follow in their father's way. And the people said, it's just not going to work. Your sons, we see you're getting very elderly, and your sons are just not following in your footsteps, and we need something else. And now we get more faithful. Here we go. Vayomru elav hine ata zakanta, uvanecha lo hochu b'drachecha. They said, you have become aged, and your sons are not walking in your path. Ata with an ayin. Therefore now, sima lanu melech l'shaftenu. Appoint for us a king. They've never had a king. They've been ruled by Joshua, after him by generations of shoftim judges, who also were not merely court judges, but were political leaders, but they weren't kings. And now you've had prophets like Shmuel, but again, not a king. And they're saying, now appoint for us a king. And here's critical words. Kechol hagoim, to govern us like all the other nations, like all the other nations. These are critical words. These are wrong words. The Torah is okay with Jews asking to have a king in Israel. The Torah is not okay with a motivation for it being so that we could be like all the other nations. We're supposed to be different from the other nations. Let's take a look. The Torah says in Devarim, the book of Deuteronomy, let's find it, here we are. In Devarim, Deuteronomy, chapter 17, here's the fifth book of the Torah. Ki tavo ha'aretz asher Hashem Elokecha noten lach, v'rishta. God is talking to the Jews while they're in the wilderness of Sinai during their 40-year trek from Mount Sinai, and then because of punishment of the incident with the 10 evil spies, they're condemned to be there 40 years in the desert until they're going to come into the land of Israel. And God is giving the nation its 613 Torah laws that they are learning as a nation in the wilderness. And during these 40 years, they're actually learning a lot of Torah. It's like a massive yeshiva. What are they doing during the 40 years in the desert? There's not baseball and football. There's not movies and television. It was a national learning experience. People were living, and every day they were learning. They were learning Judaism. They were learning Torah. And God was handing down commandments to them. And here's in chapter 17 of Devarim, Deuteronomy, a set of commandments. When you come into the land that I've promised you, because you're still in the desert, v'yashavtava, and you then dwell in it, and you're settled in. Yeshuv is a settlement. V'amarta, and then when you say, after you get settled in and you think about it, as a nation, you begin to say, Asima alay melech kechol hagoyim, asher svivotai. I'd like to have a king like all the other nations around me. God says, Som tasim alecha melech, asher yivchar Hashem elokecha bo mikerav achecha. When that point comes that you ask to have a king like all the other nations, go ahead and appoint a king. It's one of the 613 commandments. Go ahead and appoint a king whom God selects. You don't just go and pick somebody from the House of Windsor or the House of whatever, but it's got to be someone whom God will select, and who'll be someone mikerav achecha, from among your brethren. The king of Israel must be Jewish, must be one of the tribes, cannot hail from outside the Jewish people, cannot even be someone who converted to Judaism or the descendant of someone who converted to Judaism. The king of Israel must be Jewish with a straight dynastic line as a Jew. Lo tuchal latet alecha ish nachri, asher lo achichahu. You may not put a foreigner over you. And let's understand, by a foreigner, we mean someone not your brother, namely someone who does not hail from the tribes. And God, in particular, will name that person, and that will be the king. So we see in the Torah, God is okay with a king. Let's continue. And then there are some laws regarding the king. First of all, he's not allowed to have too many horses. Rak lo yarbelo susim. You see, horses in those days are like, I don't know, like Cadillacs or Lamborghinis or Teslas today. Today, cars, fancy cars, Rolls Royces. So he shouldn't have, there are people like I don't want to get into the politics of it, but like Biden was talking about when they were during that scandal about a month or so ago, they were talking about everybody is taking home security documents, confidential documents. Trump had them in Mar-a-Lago, and Biden had them, and then he found some with Pence, all these highly classified documents. Everybody takes them home when they're finished serving in office. So Biden was saying, no, the documents that I took that I shouldn't have taken were in a very secure place because they're in the garage where I keep my very expensive car. And it was like, I don't remember, something like a 1960s, I'm sorry, I don't remember the car it was, but it's like a collector's item car. The Torah is saying the king should not have collector's item cars, namely horses. He should just have as many horses as he needs for the purpose of his army, for the cavalry that are going to go to war, and they're going to need horses. But the king should not become a collector of horses, which in today's terms would be a collector of cars. Lo yarbel lo susim, shall not multiply horses to himself. What's that about? Well, the thing is that the horses, primarily the great horses, so like, again, just to use this example, it's one thing for like someone who wants to collect a lot of cars. So they collect Lamborghinis, Rolls Royces. I don't know, maybe a 1950s Buick if it's some kind of collector's item. But you don't really find a lot of people collecting like compact cars or station wagons. Okay, here's my 1994 Taurus, which was actually a pretty good car, a station wagon. Or here's my, I don't know, whoever, I don't even want to get into the Volkswagen Beetle, but because some of them became collector's items. But, like a regular mini car, a Honda Civic, it's a good car. But a wealthy person doesn't go around saying, I'd like to show you my collection of Honda Civics. They don't do that. So in the same way, the horses that a king would collect essentially would be horses from Egypt. Egyptian horses were highly coveted, and God did not want the Jews going back to Egypt because of the unique historic experience we had as slaves in Egypt. And God took us out of Egypt and commanded us several places, 3 different places in the Torah. It says, we shall not go back to Egypt. And so he did not want the king gathering horses, because it would mean going to Egypt to collect them. And he's not going to go. He's going to be sending people from the country, Jews, to Egypt. And we're not supposed to go back there. So it says the king is not supposed to gather horses. V'lo yashiva ta'am Mitzrayma. And the king is not supposed to cause people to go back to Egypt. Laman harbot sus, for the purpose of getting a lot of horses. Because God says, Vashem amar lachem. Moses says, God told you, lo tosifun lashuv b'derech hazeh od. Don't go back that way again. In addition, the king should not have an excessive amount of wives. In those days, polygamy was permitted. Yaakov Avinu, our father Jacob, had 4 wives, 2 out-and-out wives with Rachel and Leah, Rachel and Leah. And then, however you look upon Bilhah and Zilpah, some see Bilhah the handmaiden to Rachel and Zilpah the handmaiden to Leah as like concubines, and some see them as actually having been wives. But it was permitted to have more than 1 wife in the Torah. It was only 1,000 years ago that Rabbeinu Gershom, Meir HaGolah, the Rabbeinu Gershom, the light of the exile, established the decree for Ashkenazic Jews that we have to be monogamists, have only 1 wife. But until 1,000 years ago, we were allowed to have more than 1 wife. And Sephardim, technically, were still permitted to have more than 1 wife. And I mentioned in a previous class that when Israel became an established state in 48, and then when the Arabs started throwing Jews out of Yemen and other countries after Israel became a state, the Arab countries in North Africa all felt that all the Jews in their countries are potential traitors and fifth columnists supporting Israel. So there was mass expulsion of about 800,000 Jews from the Sephardic countries of North Africa. And a lot of them, like from places like Yemen, you had people coming in with 5, 6 wives. And Israel had its hands full. What are we going to do? We're not, we're a modern Western country. We're monogamous, and we want these people, they're realizing the dream of a lifetime to live in Israel, and can't really make them divorce their wives. And it was a whole mess. And they ultimately created a system where they let those people keep their wives, but no more polygamy after that. So the Torah is saying, look, the king, there's no stopping a king. Think, just from secular information, from movies, about kings and their harems, the Muslim kings with their gigantic harems. And so the Torah, anticipating, it's in the Middle East, a king in Israel in a society where you're allowed to have more than 1 wife. So the Torah commanded, when you do appoint that king, he may not have too many wives. And actually, the amount of wives that he's allowed to have before it's too many is quite a bunch. He's allowed to have up to 18 wives. 18 is not too many. 19 is too many. So the idea was that God felt that up to 18, a king and his treasury could handle it. And over 18, it had to be a cutoff somewhere. And God did not want the king tied up all day, busy with his wives. And he didn't want a situation where wives would influence the king. There's no question, I don't want to get into the politics of it, but we have had presidents of the United States, some of whose wives have been exceptionally influential in convincing their husbands to do certain things, some of whom have not succeeded. There's some very interesting history about Eleanor Roosevelt tried to convince Franklin Roosevelt to allow more Jews into the country, and she was unsuccessful. On the other hand, I don't want to get into the politics of it, but in more recent years, there have been some wives who were very powerful and convinced their husbands to do certain things. So God did not want a situation where the king's got 15, okay, but 19 and more wives, 30 wives, 40 wives, and have them start telling him what to do. One thing about telling him to throw out the garbage and do the dishes, and quite another thing about telling him to go to war and to increase taxes. And so let's understand this. Let's get there. Okay. V'lo yarbelo nashim. He should not multiply wives. V'lo yasur levavo, because that his heart not turn away. V'chesef v'zahav lo yarbelo ma'od. And he's allowed to have kesef, silver, and zahav, gold, but not too much. They missed that in the translation. The key word there is ma'od. Ma'od means too much. He shouldn't multiply for himself silver and gold too much. He should not become so obsessed with acquiring wealth and horses and wives. He should be focused on actually humility and leading the Jewish people, hopefully in peacetime, and leading a just society. And that sometimes conflicts with going out of your way to get rich, where you're suddenly attacking other countries to gain their wealth, where you're taking Jews and telling them to go to Egypt to acquire horses. So what should he do? When he sits on his throne, he should handwrite a Torah, al sefer. He should actually write a Torah scroll. And that Torah scroll, should be with him wherever he goes all the days of his life. So that he should learn to fear God and to observe all the words and commandments of the Torah and to do them, so that he does not become arrogant and brazen. That his heart, yet you're the king, and therefore you're entitled and must expect a certain dignity and honor, and you're not even allowed to waive your right to that dignity. But it's a very interesting balancing act not to be arrogant, full of yourself, haughty. And so he should not become, his heart should not be lifted above his brethren. He shouldn't be arrogant. Levilti sur min hamitzvayim min is small, that he shouldn't get to the point that he decides these laws of the Torah apply to everyone else, but not to me because I'm the king. If he follows the laws, the Kerev Yisrael, he'll have a longer life. The Gemara in Sanhedrin we'll come back to. So let's go back to Shmuel, having taken that. Actually, before I do the Shmuel, let me also take a moment for the Rambam. Now, Rambam, Maimonides, Rav Moshe ben Maimon, Rabbi Moshe, the son of Maimon. So the Hebrew 4 words, Rav, the first letter of each of those 4 words, for Rabbi Moses, the son of Maimon, Rav Moshe ben Maimon, Resh Mem Bet Mem. When you just take the acrostic of those 4 letters, that's Rambam. So we know him as Rambam. He was so famous, he's also known by I guess it's Greek, Maimonides, Ides means son of. So he's a son of Maimon. So Rambam famously compiled the Mishnah Torah, which gathered together all of Jewish law from the Talmud and the Torah, and he gathered it together and he reorganized it by subject matter and created a code of law. Nowadays, we have codes. In the United States, there's the United States Code. There's the Code of Law. And there's Title I, Title II, Title V, Title 18, famous Title 42 for civil rights. And most states, all states, California, where I'm living now, they have the environmental code and the criminal code, the vehicle code, the criminal code. So until Rambam, there was really no code of law. There was all the law as we find it in the Torah, the Bible, and in the Talmud. But it's all over the place. It's not like a dry code by subject matter, according to a let's call it an organized subject by subject, topically. And Rambam, part of what makes him incredibly historically, perhaps the most important Jew post-biblically, is he codified Jewish law. And 400 years later, his work was the foundation for the Shulchan Aruch, the Code of Jewish Law, that remains our central code for today. Now, in Rambam's Code of Jewish Law, one of his sections, one of his codes, is the law of kings and wars. Hilchot Malachim. So I'm not going to go through all of it, but let's just get a little flavor of it, because tonight's class, chapter 8, it is critical to have a concept and understanding of what we're talking about when we talk about a king. Shalosh mitzvot nitztavu Yisrael b'shat knisatan la'aretz. In the desert of Sinai, God commanded that when we enter Israel, there are 3 things we've got to get done. A lot of the laws apply right away here in Sinai Desert. Other laws will apply when you get settled into Israel and you'll start growing crops. You'll have to start giving teruma and maaser. We talked about that on Thursday night in our Mishnah class. You'll have to start giving tithes and gifts of vegetables and fruit to the Kohen, first fruits. When you move to Israel, you'll have to do this. You have to, etc. But right away when you enter, there are 3 orders of business that take priority. What are they? Lemanot lahamelach, that you should appoint a king. And in fact, did not appoint a king for like 400 years. From the time that Jews arrived from Joshua and set up the Mishkan in Shiloh for 369 years. And we're past that period now because we know that the Mishkan, no longer is at the center, and the Aron was taken away by the Philistines. Excuse me. So at 400 years, they had not yet appointed that king. And they have to wipe out the Amalekites for once and for all, which was not ultimately successfully done. And to build a Beit HaMikdash, a holy temple. And that was done, but that took time also, more than 400 years, more even than the king, because the Beit HaMikdash, the holy temple, was not built until King Solomon, who was after King Saul, and after King David. It was only during the 3rd king, and that's after 400 some odd years. But these are the 3 priorities when we come into the land. So the Rambam talks about it. I'm not going to go through all of it right away. That would be a class unto itself. But to get an idea of the king, Ein ma'amidin melech mikahal gerim, afilu achar kama darot ad shetiyah imo Yisrael. We never, ever appoint a king who has converted to Judaism except for someone who has a Jewish mother. And by the way, for other positions of leadership in a Torah society, it must be a person born Jewish, not a convert, and not someone non-Jewish who who maybe loves the Jewish people and becomes very much central to helping build the Jewish people, but nevertheless cannot be the leader of Israel. Lo l'malchut bilvad, not only that does that apply to the king, but for all the leaders, l'chol hasrorot sheb Yisrael, for all officers and all military leaders like the defense minister and chief of staff, ve'ein tzarich lomar dayan o nasi, and likewise judges, shelo yehei ela miYisrael. This was a big thing in the 1920s or so. The British were given Palestine, the land of Israel, after World War I. I've talked about it in the past. I'll always refer to it because it keeps coming up. In the aftermath of World War I, Turkey and the Ottoman Empire had been occupying most of the Middle East, much of it, including Palestine, which is Israel. And after the war, Britain was given several parts of the Ottoman Empire, and France was given other parts. We've talked about that. And Britain was given, among other places, Palestine, Israel, which is why, very seriously, that's why Israel, the second language after Hebrew, is English. Whereas in Lebanon, it's French. Or Syria, it's French. Or Morocco, it's French. So we would be talking, Jews would be talking more French if the French had been given, Israel. But it was given to Britain. And Britain appointed a high commissioner, the representative of the government of the United Kingdom, who would be their man running the show in Palestine. And they named a guy named Sir Herbert Samuel. And he happened to be Jewish. And it actually was a big thing. Britain didn't even mean it that way. They didn't realize how it would be taken by the Jews in Palestine. The idea that for the first time in 2,000 years, a Jew, albeit under the employ of England and the Prime Minister and the King and the Queen of England, but for the first time in 2,000 years, a Jew was in charge of Palestine. And it meant a tremendous amount. Now understand, there's all kinds of Jews. So, I mean, a lot of the American presidents name ambassadors from the United States to Israel, and they name Jews, and a lot of these ambassadors we could do without. Better off to have a non-Jew who's pro-Israel than to have some of the Jews there that have been really pretty tough. But Herbert Samuel was very, very much an important part. So the leaders have to be, so the king has to be Jewish. Ein ma'amidin isha b'malchut. And a woman is not a king of Israel. We don't have a queen of Israel, according to Torah law. It happens to be when there was the civil war that saw 10 of the 12 tribes break off and split the country and the people into two parts. The northern kingdom of Samaria, which comprised 10 tribes, and the southern kingdom of Judah, Yehuda, which was 2 tribes, Binyamin and Yehuda, and also the tribe of Levi that was assigned to the Beit HaMikdash, the Holy Temple. In that era, there were certain queens. I don't just mean the wife of the king, but actually a ruling queen, and it's not according with Jewish law. Okay, just sharing you. This is what it is. And likewise, you don't make of a king someone who previously has been a butcher, meaning somebody in the meat business, or a barber, or someone who runs a bathhouse, right? In the old days, they did not have indoor plumbing and showers, so you went to a bathhouse. Nor a tanner, someone who takes leather and prepare. That stinks. Just the work of a tannery stinks terribly. Someone who has a position of employment that is profoundly undignified in terms of what it was in those days. It was not considered. Maybe Figaro was the most important guy in his. If you know the Barber of Seville, so the famous song of Figaro, 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 Figaro. He talks about how he's the barber and he's the most important guy in town, and everybody comes to Figaro. Well, that works in the opera and that works with Figaro, but for the Jews, A barber, I mean, you need a barber, you need a haircut, but not, these people don't become kings, are not supposed to, if that's been one of his jobs. And as I said, likewise, you need a kosher butcher. The Jewish community cannot exist without a kosher butcher. Can't have everybody vegan. I mean, I'm sure vegans disagree with that, but people who want meat, we love our butcher, but he can't be a king. Okay. So in other words, the king is someone who has to be very dignified from the people of Israel, a male, and he has to be appointed initially by the prophet, Navi. Navi, afterwards, it becomes dynastic. Okay. And when eventually, Rambam says, the kingship, the dynasty went over to David, that became an perpetual, eternal dynasty that never could be broken. No other family could ever be the dynasty over the Jews. Kings of the Davidic dynasty will prevail forever. Down to the time of Messiah, Mashiach, will come Mashiach ben David, that will come from the house of David. And that means that the kings of the northern kingdom of the 10 tribes, well, the line of David was from Judah, so all the tribes and their kings were essentially illegitimate to some degree. So they might have had kings, but those kings, so in contrast, should a king arise from other Israelites, that monarchy will eventually cease. For behold, Yeravam was told, I will afflict the house of David, but not forever. But Yeravam was the king up in the north, and he lost the monarchy, and so on and so forth. Okay. Only a descendant of David may be appointed as king in Jerusalem, and only descendants of David are appointed with the special anointing oil. Okay. Chapter 2. Again, I'm not going to go through all of it, but I've picked 3 chapters I want to give you a little bit about. The king must be given great honor. Kavod gadol nohagin b'melech umesimin lo ema v'yira b'lev kol adam. The king of Israel must be accorded great honor, and you must fear him like crazy. He has the authority to have you executed without a jury, without a trial. Under Torah law, the king can have anybody executed simply by saying so. Ein rochvin al suso. You don't ride on his horse, even if he lets you. Ve'ein yoshvin al kiso. And you don't sit on his throne. Like if he's out of town and the room's just empty. Ve'ein mishtamshim b'shar vito. And you happen to see his royal scepter, you're not allowed to touch it. V'lo b'chitro, you're not allowed to put his, like for a gag, you're not allowed to put his crown on your head. V'lo be'achad mikol klei tashmisha, anything that's part of his royal attire, his clothes, and stuff like a crown and a scepter, and let's say he wears a necklace, a chain, you're not allowed to touch it. And when he dies, all his possessions of that nature are burned, so that no one ever again can make use of them. And if someone has been his servant, or his maid, his handmaiden, or some kind of assistant or steward, no one else ever is allowed to have that guy or that woman be his assistant or his steward. Only another successor king could ever have those people. But the wife of a king, when the king dies, she remains unmarried the rest of her life. No one, not even a successor king, is allowed to be with her. Even a subsequent king is not allowed to marry the widow or divorcee from a previous king. And it talks about you're not allowed to see him when he's naked, let's say coming out of the bathhouse. You're not allowed to see the king when he's getting a haircut. So the barber has to come to him. because it's regarded as beneath his dignity. You should never see the king. You should not see him when he's in the bathhouse. You know, you've seen this, these scenes are like in a Schwitz in the Catskill Mountains or wherever, where a bunch of people are sitting there naked, a bunch of men are sitting there naked or whatever. Not allowed to see the king naked ever. There has to be this fear of the king. Okay. He's supposed to get a haircut every day. So what is that, like a gazillionth of an inch, of a centimeter of hair? But he's supposed to always look perfectly kempt, perfectly, just perfectly groomed. And he's supposed to wear the finest garments. The king is not allowed to walk around in jeans, not even expensive jeans, not even Tommy Bahama jeans. King has to walk around, the king has to look like a king. Think of Queen Elizabeth. Can you imagine Queen Elizabeth in jeans? Now, maybe she was when she was 20 years old. I don't know. I have no idea. But the Queen Elizabeth I got to know from television, not only did she not show up in jeans, but did you notice she had this thing about how her hat was always the same color as her garments, as her shoes? Like she wasn't into contrasting mix and match. It was, I don't even know how she found hats like that. I don't know if they spray painted them or what, but no matter what shade of a color her royal whatever was, her hat was that shade and her shoes were that shade. And so is her mum, the queen mum. They always stress that there's a certain gallantry to the king of Israel. And we're not allowed to see that king in anything other than his glory. Kederach shechalak lo hakatuv, hakavod hagadol, v'chayev hakol bechvodo, kach tzivahu liot libo b'kerbo shafal v'chalal. This is what I talked about earlier, a very interesting navigating of a line. On the one hand, the Torah gives him this extraordinary honor and glory and requires everyone to treat him with this awe and glory. And yet the Torah also says he has to be humble and modest. How do you do that? It really takes something. And he has to be very, very merciful and kind and gracious. And his focus should be on their needs and on their good and on their welfare. And just as everyone's supposed to respect and honor him, he should respect even the smallest of the small. Interesting. So it's really, it's hard to find such kings, I guess, but he would be a truly great person, a person of greatness, who's able to achieve that balance. We talked about, not going to spend a lot of time on it, that he should write a Torah. And that Torah goes with him wherever he goes for the rest of his life. So that Torah, lo yazuz mofanav, it does not leave him except when he goes to the bathroom. You don't bring a Torah into a bathroom. Any holy book at all, even if it's in a secular language like English, a book about the Bible, is not allowed to be brought into a bathroom. A prayer book, a siddur, certainly a Torah. But other than that, and likewise a bathhouse. But anywhere else, Yotzei l'mochama, v'huimo. If he goes to war, the Torah comes with him. Nichnas, v'huimo. When he comes in, the Torah's with him. Yoshe badin, v'huimo. If he's sitting in judgment as a judge, Torah's alongside him. May save, v'hu kenegdo. When he's sitting, the Torah should be near him. The Torah that he writes should be with him. Lo yarbelo nashim, we learned it. He's not allowed to have too many wives, should not amass many wives. And it was tradition that he may not have more than 18 wives. And we talked about that. And they say what do you call it? The palakshim, the concubines are counted among them. Okay. and he shouldn't have too many horses. We talked about them. Just what he needs for his own chariot and for the army. But one extra too many is not allowed. And he shouldn't gather too much silver or gold to keep in his royal treasury so he could show off. Look at the royal treasury. Like everybody talks about the royal jewels, the crown jewels of the Queen of England or the King and other countries, their crown jewels. In Judaism, they're not supposed to be showing off their jewels, and they're not supposed to be maximizing their wealth more than they need. Just what his soldiers need to be paid their salaries, and his servants and those who work for him. And all the silver and gold that he does have should be kept at the Holy Temple treasury. And it should be there, and the money in the treasury should be there for the needs of the public, and God forbid when we have to go to war. Okay, so I wanted to cover some of that about the king, and let's just get back into chapter 8, and you'll see why this was so important. So they said to Shmuel, "You've become old. Your sons have not followed in your path." And we've encountered that before, haven't we? Eli the Kohen, who was succeeded by Shmuel the Navi. Initially, Eli had the sons Chafni and Pinchas, but they did not match up to his standard. Moshe Rabbeinu, our teacher Moshe, he had sons Gershom and Eliezer, but they did not succeed him as leaders. Rather, Yehoshua, Joshua, from the tribe of Ephraim, succeeded him. So the people said, "Please name us a king." Vayera hadavar b'nei Shmuel kasher amru, and it really bothered him. It was evil in the eyes of Shmuel. He was deeply displeased. Why? The Torah said, when you come to Israel, you'll have a king. Why is he upset? Because of the way they said it. Because they said, "Tenal lanu melech l'shaftenu." The way they said it was that they want to be like the nations around us. Vayitpalel Shmuel Hashem. So Samuel prayed on it. That's the expression you even hear in English today. Something like, "I hear you. I'm going to go home now. I'm going to pray on it. I'm going to ask God to speak to me." He could do that as it's very presupposing and presumptive when a person says, "I'm going to go home and pray on it and see what God tells me." And it takes a lot of humility to pray to God, and you hope that you get a feeling in your prayer that you get but just to say, "I'm going to go home and God spoke to me," it's a little bit presumptuous. But he's a Navi. He's a prophet. That's what prophets do. Vayomer Hashem el Shmuel, Shema b'kol ha'am. And God said to Samuel, "Hearken to the nation's voice. Do what they want, because they're not rejecting you." In other words, for Shmuel, it's a personal ego thing, that he's the leader, now they want someone else. They're not rejecting you. They're rejecting me. L'chol asher yomru le'elecha. Do what they're asking. Ki lo otcha ma'asu. It's not you they're despising. Ki oti ma'asu mimlach le'em. It is I, God Almighty, whom they're rejecting from being their king. I mean, we refer to our God, our King, Hashem Elokeinu, Baruch Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam. When we say a blessing before you drink a cup of water, before you eat bread, when you say a blessing before you light the Hanukkah candles, before you read the Megillah, we're going to do it, God willing, next week. I'm sending out an email, let you all know about our annual Megillah reading on Zoom. You say a bracha, Baruch Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam. Blessed are you, God, Lord our God, King of the universe. And now they're saying, God is saying, now they want a king. I'm their king. This is what they've always done, these Jews. That's what God is saying. I would never say it's a big sin to speak bad about Jewish people, the Jewish people. I mean, if there's someone individual who's an apostate, that's another story. But to just speak bad about the Jews is a sin. But God God speaks. God can. He's saying, look, Jews have been a problem for me. From the day I took them out of Egypt to this day, I've had a lot of problems. And there are those who have followed false gods. So that's what they're doing to me. Now they're doing it to you. Ba'ata with an ayin, shma b'kolam. But hearken unto what they're asked for. Just let them know what they've asked for. Okay? Hashem loch aleim. Let them know what it's going to mean to have a king. Who was it? H.L. Mencken once said about democracy, which, don't mistake me, democracy, I'm in favor of democracy. But H.L. Mencken once said, democracy is the theory of government that the people know what they want and they deserve to get it good and hard. And so that's what God is saying. They want a king, let them have a king. What's the expression? Be careful what you ask for, you just may get it. Tell them what it's going to mean. So Shmuel tells the people, here's what you're asking for. I want you all to know this is what you're going to get when you get a king. Who will rule over you. Et benechem yikach. He will take your sons from you. V'som lo b'merkavto u'v'farashav, in order to recruit them and draft them into his army on his personal chariots. V'ratzu lifnei markavto, and even in peacetime, not only wartime, he will take your sons to be part of his standing army so that they're outrunners for his chariots. And he's going to have Sarei Alefim, Sarei Chamishim, V'lacharosh Chavisho, V'litzor Ktsiro. And he's going to have a lot of fields. If you have a king, he's going to seize lands. He's going to have fields. Who do you think is going to be working those lands, farming those lands? Your sons. They will be taken from their homes. They will be drafted, not necessarily to the army, but to be farmers for the king. V'la'asot klei milchamto, and others will be taken from your homes to work as blacksmiths, to make his weapons. Uchalei rechbo, in his chariots. And your daughters, they're not getting off easy. Your daughters will be taken from your homes. L'rakachot u'letabachot u'le'ofot, because he's going to need cooks. And he's going to need bakers. Because he's going to have big, big, big banquets. Not only when there's a visiting dignitary, but every day. He'll end up with 50, 100 people every day for lunch. Just because he's the king. And who do you think is going to do all that cooking? He's not going to go on one of the online sites to find workers, okay? I don't know if Craigslist is still out there. I was going to say Craigslist, it changes by the minute. I don't want to date myself too much. It's been a while since I've had to hire anybody online. But he's going to just go. He's going to grab women. He's going to grab your daughters to be his cooks. And where do you think he's going to get those fields and those vineyards? That's your vineyards. That's your fields. He's going to invoke eminent domain. He's going to just say, I'm the king, and I'm taking your field. And that I just spent time with you going through Rambam so you could get a feel of the authority and power and sovereignty of a king of Israel under Torah law. That's why I took out the time so you could see what Shmuel's talking about. This king has no restrictions. He'll take your olive orchards, v'notan lavadav, and he won't just take them for himself. Let's say he has servants whom he wants to bestow who he wants to bestow gifts. He'll take your olive orchards and give it to them as presents. It's your birthday. Here, I'm going to this guy. Take his orchard. He'll take, and if you're lucky enough that he doesn't literally seize your entire field and your entire vineyard, he'll take 1/10 of it. He'll say, just like you're supposed to give it to the Levi, a tithe, give it to me. And he'll give that to his workers. And I'm finishing up in a second. He'll just take yours. If he's going to take your sons and your daughters, you can be sure he's going to take your servants. Those of you fortunate enough to have servants and handmaidens, he'll take them. And those of you that have donkeys or asses, he'll take them. Sonchem Yasor, he'll take your sheep. Attempt Yulol Avadim, and you're going to be his servants. You want that? There's 2 more verses, we're done. You'll be crying out to God because of that king, the one you chose. And God's not going to save you. If you want a king, don't come crying. God's basically saying, don't come crying to me later. And we close with this for right now. And the people would not listen to Shmuel. No, we want a king anyway. And so they'll get a king, good and hard. What will end up happening, we'll learn more. Now, next week is Purim. I'll be sending out emails. Please check out the emails I send out so you're able to figure out what's on schedule, what's not. Next week, rather than studying Tuesday night, we won't be having our class next week on Tuesday night. We will have next week's Sunday class and Thursday class, and we will have this week's Thursday class. But next Tuesday's class we won't have. We'll be doing Megillah. Again, be on the lookout for the emails. And by the way, as we close, today is late February 28th. Our shul was founded February 29th, 2008. So we will be marking our 15th anniversary as a shul, Young Israel of Orange County, Mazel Tov. But we're only going to have a billionth of a second to celebrate, because no sooner will February 28th end, and you're ready to start taking out the candles and the cake and the little razzle-dazzle sounds. It'll already be March 1st, and February 29th is gone. So enjoy it while it's there. Mazel Tov on the 15th anniversary of our shul, and thank you so much for being with us tonight. Laila Tov. Bye-bye.